Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast, your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flottam.
Hey, Jeff and Kim. Did you know that today's podcast sponsor, Glory Bee, has been in business since 1975? Since their origins as a family honey business, they've been working to help people who choose to live a healthier, more natural life. Glory Bee provides honey and hive products, and also natural cooking and baking ingredients, alternative sweeteners. They have beekeeping supplies. They have natural bath and body craft supplies. Glory Bee is a True Source certified and certified B Corp. Both those certifications demonstrate Glory Bee's dedication to sustainability, stewardship, and integrity. Also, check out their Save the Bee program. It actively supports bee population health. You can find more about Glory Bee and their healthy living products online at glorybee.com. That's glorybee, GLORYBEE.com.
Kim, this will be a fun podcast. Every time I go into the grocery store and I'm looking at this list, looking at all those jars of honey on the shelf, and, as a consumer, I'm looking at it saying, how can I tell if that honey's real honey? How can I tell the source, or where did that honey come from? Is that a blend? Is that a mix? It's challenging.
It is, Jeff, and it has gotten more challenging in the last decade or so with the issues that we've had with honey from overseas and even adulterated honey in this country, which is why our guest today and the people he works with formed True Source Honey, so that there is an organization out there that you can depend on. I met Eric, and Eric and I were on a public radio interview show a while back, and some of the things that he said that True Source did really got my interest, which is why I was interested in getting him here today.
Well, that'll be fun. I look forward to talking to him. So let's get him called up here on Zoom and get the show on the road.
Okay.
All right. Well, Kim, you know Eric, and you've worked with him a little bit. Why don't you introduce him here to the group?
Folks, I want you to meet Eric Wenger. He's the chairman of True Source Honey, but he's also the director of honey procurement and quality at Barkman Honey in Hillsboro, Kansas, which is just outside of Wichita. He serves on the National Honey Board, and he's a member of the National Honey Packers and Dealers. If it's about honey, I think Eric probably knows it. I'm pretty impressed with his credentials there. Eric and I met on a public radio show a while back, and his description of what True Source Honey really got my attention, and this is why I wanted him to come on today. So, welcome, Eric. We're glad you could make it. I guess certainly the first question is, tell me a little bit about what True Source Honey is and does, and what you want people to know, and then we'll go into some of the things that you really do as part of that organization.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Kim. And so if I'm going to come here and talk about True Source, I think one of the first questions that I would ask as a listener is, why True Source? What's the benefit to me? Why should it matter? And I think the answer to that question, the important point for your listeners to hear, is that True Source and the companies associated with this program really have a few pretty basic goals. And the first one is that no circumvented Chinese honey should enter the U.S. That's number one. Number two is all honey sold in the U.S. should honestly declare where it comes from. Regardless of U.S. or import country, that should be openly stated. And three, all honey should be pure honey, not adulterated honey. And so if you would agree with those 3 points, if those 3 points resonate with you, no circumvented Chinese honey, honestly declare where that honey came from, and no adulterated honey, then you're already largely in agreement with everyone associated with True Source Honey, because fundamentally that's what True Source Honey and True Source Certified is really all about. Now, from here, we'll go into the details of how True Source got started. And there's kind of two pieces. It's True Source Honey, which is an organization, and then there's True Source Certified, which is a certification system that allows companies to prove that they're really kind of pursuing these three goals and adhering to the practices that True Source Honey recommends as you consider how honey is going to be, sourced and bottled and sold in the U.S. And so that's in a nutshell why True Source Honey should matter to you if you share those same three goals.
That's good.
So with that said, we can maybe go into a little bit of the history where True Source Honey came from. How did it even get started? And to start that discussion, we really kind of need to rewind about probably 12, 15, maybe 18 years, where this all kind of got started. And this was long before True Source was created. Was if you've been around the industry for a while, you remember the anti-dumping duty that was placed on Chinese honey. And that was back at a time when really, really cheap Chinese honey was getting dumped into the U.S. market. This Chinese honey had quality concerns. There were adulteration concerns. And it was simply, at a price, too cheap.
Eric, let me interrupt. Let me ask a quick question just for clarification. When you say it was being dumped, can you kind of define dumped?
Well, so dumping is a term that's used in international trade when one country is shipping goods to another country at a rate, and those goods are being sold at a rate that's below the cost of production in the country of origin. And so that's I think an international trade term, dumping. And so that's something that I'm not an international trade expert, but that's there are agreements between countries that practice shouldn't happen, and when it's identified, there's an opportunity for the sort of the victim country here, if you will, can bring a case against that other country and then take action against that dumping activity that's happening. And so that's what happened, and we should recognize that back at the time when that anti-dumping order was first put into place, that was through the work of the American Honey Producers Association and the Sioux Honey Association, and I think it's important to point out how valuable that action was, because that action essentially made it illegal to bring Chinese honey into the United States without paying a substantial duty, and which is an extra amount that gets tacked on to whatever you've sold the honey for. You have to pay this duty rate in order to get it into the U.S. And to understand how important that action was, if you look at Europe, so Europe does not have any prohibition against the import of Chinese honey. In 2006, China had about 7% of the European market. So of all the honey that Europe used, they used 7% of honey from China. By 2015, that number had risen to 45% of the European market. So China had gone from 7% of the European market to 49% of the European market in 9 years. And that's potentially what we could have seen in the U.S. without this anti-dumping duty, and without the anti-dumping order and the duty associated with it. And so that's really where all this started. Well, as soon as that duty was put into place, Chinese companies started to try to figure out how to get around it. How can we sell this honey to the United States in circumvention of this duty, so we don't have to pay the money and we can still get rid of this honey? And
the path of least resistance is always sought.
Right. And so, and there was a lot of money at stake here when the conventional market, and it depends on what year you pick, because this has been going on for a lot of years, but usually there's a significant gap in between what this circumvented honey was being sold for and what legitimate honey, sourced from origin or purchased here in the United States was worth. And so there was a lot of incentive to do this. And at the time, what had happened was we kind of had a two-tiered market in the U.S., and any company that was willing to trade in this invented Chinese honey was able to buy it and then sort of sell it on to their customers at a cheaper price than anyone who was choosing only to buy honey, from openly declared from other countries of origin. And when this Chinese honey came into the country, you wouldn't declare it as Chinese because you weren't really supposed to be importing it without paying the duty. So you had to say it was from somewhere else. And what would happen was that the scheme was this honey would either ship to a third country, or the paperwork would just be manipulated to show that it had gone to a third country, and then it would come into the United States. And one example is Malaysia. So I can't remember what year it was. It was 2010. In 2010, there were 33 million pounds of Malaysian honey that was imported into the United States. And that's, if you look at the import records, just a couple of years prior to that, there was almost no Malaysian honey imported to the United States. And so this was a volume that was essentially fabricated. It wasn't real honey production. This was circumvented honey because there wasn't an anti-dumping duty on Malaysia, only on China. And so that's what was going on in the industry. And this was happening sort of prior to and during the creation of True Source Honey and True Source Certified. So what we had is companies in the United States, and these were the companies that participated in the development of True Source and have since become involved with True Source. Was these companies had to make a decision. Are we going to participate in this Chinese circumvention thing, or are we going to stand against it? And if you stand against it, which is the right choice, you don't have any way to convince someone that you did the right thing, because everyone says they did the right thing. So, back in those days, you could ask every honey company in the United States, do you circumvent Chinese honey? Well, you know what the answer is. It's no. Of course, we don't circumvent Chinese honey. We only buy legitimate honey. We don't circumvent honey. We buy it straight from the beekeepers all over the world, in the U.S. and everywhere else. So, of course, no, we would never circumvent Chinese honey. Well, we know that's not true. We saw some years later with the indictments that the Department of Justice brought against companies in the United States for exactly this practice. So we know that there were companies who were circumventing at that time, and we suspect that practice, while it may not be quite as prevalent as it used to be, we see that there is still evidence of some of that going on today. And so that's the environment that existed when True Source was created. And so these companies said, well, we can choose not to participate in this circumvention business, but now we have to figure out, how are we going to explain to the retailers and the consumers, how are we going to convince them that we're doing things the right way? And so the start of that was True Source Honey was the collection of some packers and an importer that do business in the United States, and said, okay, well, let's just make a website and let's explain this to everybody. And that website it's truesourcehoney.com. That was the website that was created, back in probably maybe 2009 or 10, somewhere in there. And the website, the intent of the website was to kind of lay out the whole proposition of, here's what's going on. People are circumventing honey. And, us members of True Source Honey, the companies who believe in these principles of how you should behave, we don't do that. We don't circumvent honey. We're doing this the right way. And so it was an educational website, and that's great. But just having an educational website isn't really any more convincing than just telling someone, hey, we do this the right way. And so what we realized when we thought about this was, a lot of the big retailers in the United States and the big food manufacturers, we all have to undergo audits of all different kinds of audits, almost continuously, it seems like. There's organic audits. There's audits for if you use a kosher declaration on your food. There's audits now for non-GMO. And there's lots of audits for food safety. And so what's happened is, if a big retailer wants to buy a product from a company, what they do is they say, well, we don't have the resources to send our employees to your factory to inspect it. So we want you to have what's called a third-party food safety audit. And that is another company that's neither the retailer nor the packer. That company is going to come into your facility, and they're just going to nose around the place. They're going to look at everything you've got going on. They're going to walk through your facility. They're going to inspect everything that you do. They're going to look at all your paperwork. They're going to look at your documentation. They're going to make sure your employees wash their hands. They're going to make sure that you have a clean facility, and you make sure that you follow all the best practices of manufacturing food. And this auditor comes in, once a year or maybe more than that, and does this inspection. And then when they're done with that inspection, they report back to the retailer. They send the retailer a report and says, okay, well, we've inspected this facility and they're following all the rules for safe food manufacture. So in our industry, in the food industry, all the packers, all the food manufacturers, and all the retailers, and all the the companies that would use, for example, honey as an ingredient, everyone is really familiar with how this works, right? You have this company come in, they check you out, they report their findings to any of your customers that you would do business with, and if they find a problem, they report it. They say, hey, listen, we went to this company and boy, they had really dirty floors. They're not doing a very good job of cleaning. So, if you're worried about that, you may want to find another supplier because these folks aren't doing a very good job. So what I've just been describing doesn't have anything to do with honey and circumvention, but it's the system that all honey packers, all food manufacturers, all retailers are already used to. And so what we said, TrueSource, the folks that were involved with TrueSource said, hey, what we need to do is we need to create a program that works the same way as those other audits, but we need to make it specific to these issues. We need to make it about circumvented Chinese honey. We need to make it about openly and honestly declaring where your honey came from. We need to make it about the purity of your honey. And so that's where TrueSource Certified came from. And it was built around this very familiar model to everyone that you have an independent third party come into your facility, snoop around, check all your records, and look at all the details of how you operate your business to make sure you're following the rules that you should be following. And so that's where the idea of TrueSource Certified came from.
Who performs the audit? Is that TrueSource that performs the audit, or is there a third party that performs the audit?
Nope, it's an independent third party. So the company that TrueSource has made arrangements with, the company is called NSF, and they're a company that's recognized in the U.S. and around the world. They actually do lots of audits. That NSF is a company. They'll do organic audits. They'll do food safety audits. They'll do a GMO audit, and they also will do the TrueSource audit. And so they're contracted to conduct these audits all over the United States and in fact around the world as part of the TrueSource Certified program. And so the way these things work, and this is actually part of how these systems work that I didn't explain, is there's always what's called a governing body, and the governing body is the group that writes the rules. And then there's what's called a certification body. And the certification body is the one that goes out into all the factories to do the work. So TrueSource is the governing body. TrueSource wrote the rules because TrueSource is composed of companies in the honey industry. And so we understand how all this works. We understand how the schemes work. We understand how people try to cheat the system. And so we wrote the rules to try and capture and detect any of that suspicious activity. And then the certification body, which is NSF, they're the ones that take that checklist and walk through the factory, and they've been told exactly here's what you need to inspect, here's what you need to look for, and it gives them all the details of what they need to do. But they're independent of our industry, so that way there's someone that's not they're not part of the industry, and they can come in and do basically an inspection with no skin in the game other than they just need to do a good job of doing this inspection and report what they find when they're done.
I think, Eric, one of the things when we did that radio show was you also talked about third-party inspections of exporters from other countries.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a rigorous process. Can you share a little bit of that? I was impressed with that.
Yeah, sure. And let me maybe just back up a half a step. So TrueSource has certified members, and the people that are certified, these are the people that undergo the audits and the inspections, and those are U.S. packers and foreign exporters. And so, exporters in countries that ship honey to the United States. And so that's the question you just asked, Kim, is what does a foreign exporter have to do to get certified? And there's actually a fairly substantial list. So all of the countries that export honey to the United States in any significant volume, we've classified them as either a high-risk country or a low-risk country. So, for example, low-risk countries are generally South American countries. They've never really been identified as countries that have been involved in any of these circumvention schemes. A lot of these countries are very protective of their agricultural industries, and so the governments in those countries actually take fairly aggressive action to make sure that nothing suspicious goes on because they don't want to damage their reputation. So there are other countries that have been identified as high-risk countries, and all of these countries and their classifications are listed in the sort of the rules for how True Source Certified works. But in a high-risk country, they have the most rigorous criteria that they have to follow. And so, for example, high-risk countries, and I'll use India as an example. In India, before you can even undergo the True Source Certified audit, you actually have to undergo a Grant Thornton financial audit. And what those auditors are instructed to do is they look at all of your financial records to determine what you might be buying from any other country. They're looking for, are you potentially buying honey from another country? In this case, China would have been the country of concern. Are you buying honey from China and then trying to resell it, make it appear as if it's honey from India? And so in India, you can import Chinese honey to India, but you have to pay a tariff on it, just like in the U.S. if you were to import Chinese honey to the U.S. And so that's what these auditors are looking for. It's an extensive and it's an expensive audit just right out of the gate that you've got to go through. That you've got to clear that hurdle before you're even qualified to undergo the True Source Certified audit. So
how much is one of those audits?
That's a good question, and I am not certain, but I think it is in the neighborhood of $5,000 to $10,000.
And that fee is handled by the exporter, the company exporting, not the government.
Correct. That's right. That's the company that wants to become certified is the one that pays that fee.
Is that a one-time fee, or is that an annual fee, or each?
It's actually every other year. Every other year, even after you've become certified, you have to undergo another audit to make sure that you haven't changed your business practices since you got certified. So once you clear that hurdle, now and the audit company actually contacts NSF, and remember NSF is our third-party auditor. So the financial company or the Grant Thornton auditor contacts NSF and said, hey, they've successfully passed their financial audit, so you're cleared to proceed now with your True Source Certified audit. So what happens next is the NSF auditor goes into that factory, goes into that exporter's facility, and looks at all their records of purchase, looks at all the beekeepers that they've bought their honey from, and what they do is conduct a mass balance. And it says, okay, how much honey do you report you've sold, and how much honey do you report that you've bought? And let's make sure that balances. And then they let's look at the list of all the beekeepers that you say you've bought honey from. And now we're going to pick randomly off this list, and we're going to go pick about 10 or 12 of these beekeepers, and we're going to drive out into the countryside, and we're going to interview these beekeepers, and we're going to make sure that the number you say you bought from them, the number of pounds you bought from them is the same as the number you recorded in your books back at the factory. And the purpose of that is just to make sure that, someone's not making up a beekeeper, buying Chinese honey and saying it came from, beekeeper, A, B, and C. So they go out in the field, they interview these beekeepers and make sure that those volumes match up, that things make sense there. And then they also want to make sure that the amount of honey they bought from a beekeeper, that beekeeper has enough beehives, enough colonies to support that level of production. So if a beekeeper says, well, I sold 100,000 pounds of honey to this exporter, well, then you need to show us, let's look at how many colonies you have. How many do you have? Oh, well, I've got 100. Well, that doesn't track. You can't sell 100,000 pounds if you only have 100 colonies. So we've got a problem here. And throw up a red flag on this audit report. And so
you have to have some pretty skilled, relatively skilled people to make that kind of inspection. I mean, you're going to have a beekeeper out there.
Well, and it's not necessarily we're gonna conduct a hive health inspection and make sure that you pop a lid and count frames. But when you go, and the auditors are trained to, when you go into an apiary, there's a difference between a yard that's full of empty boxes and a yard that's full of beehives. And, you need to pop a lid and make sure that there are colonies in there. We talk to these auditors about, what could you do to beat this system? Well, let's say you had a bunch of boxes and you put syrup inside the boxes and it looks like there's lots of flight activity, right? So you've got to pop the lid and look inside and make sure things look like a normal bee colony. But you're right, Kim. There has to be some education of these auditors so that they understand what they're looking at. They don't just go look for, some boxes in a field, but they actually have to look in them.
So that's interesting because the stories that the auditors would come up with, the way that people are trying to scam the system. I mean, the thought of just putting sugar syrup inside a hive just to create a lot of flight activity, I would have never thought of that. But someone who must have seen that somewhere. So I'd be kind of curious, what are the crazy things people have done to try to cheat the system?
Well, and so here's an important point to understand about how TrueSource works is that the way we designed this program is we wanted to make it complicated enough, rigorous enough, and effective enough that if you were going to be a cheater, you really didn't want to bother going through all this. That if you were going to be a cheater, you didn't want to pay for a financial audit, you didn't want to pay for an auditor, you didn't want to have to figure out how to rig 10,000 boxes of bees out in some random field to look like they were actually full of bees when they weren't. I mean, all that would be an incredible amount of work. And so in part, we designed this program to be complicated enough to discourage a cheater from trying to pass, so from trying to fake this and pass. And so, and truth be told, no matter what country you're in, beekeepers are not the problem. I mean, this, if you're going out in the field to visit a real beekeeper anywhere, no beekeeper likes the idea of someone selling honey from another country or selling syrup and trying to pass it off as coming from the country they live in, whether that's a U.S. beekeeper or an Indian beekeeper or an Argentine beekeeper. None of them like that. And so, generally speaking, at the beekeeping level, that part of the inspection is mostly to make sure that the exporter or the packer in the U.S. is being honest, that they're not misrepresenting volumes from beekeepers. And that's really where the biggest where the biggest problem would be observed is if an exporter is saying, I buy 1 million pounds from this beekeeper, but when you go see the beekeeper, he's just a beekeeper with 500 colonies. Well, it's not that there's anything wrong with the beekeeper. It's just that the exporter is not telling the truth about how much he purchased from that beekeeper because backfilling it with suspect product.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah. So that's kind of, so we've gone to the exporter's facility, we've checked out their facility, their purchasing records, gone to the beekeepers and checked them out. Then sort of back at the exporter's facility, samples are collected from the inventory that they've got on the floor there. Those samples are sent out for analysis. And right now, the primary analysis, besides a purity test, is pollen analysis, because one of the requirements of TrueSource is that for exporters, all their honey has to have its full natural complement of pollen. You can't, they're not allowed to filter or strain out pollen at any point in their purchase or any point in their processing. And so when that sample gets sent off for a pollen analysis, it has to have that full complement of pollen. And that pollen the origin has to be determined as the country in which you're operating. So again, if using India as the example, if you're in India, you send the sample off, the analysis has to come back as, this honey is tested as coming from India. So if you've gone through all that process and you've passed the audit, now you're a TrueSource certified exporter. Now, again, if you're in a high-risk country, and let's say you're ready to ship your first container load of honey from India to the United States. Now, one of the other requirements of the program is that honey has to be inspected and sampled before it's allowed to ship. So an auditor, you'll call NSF again, and the auditor will come to your facility, and they'll look at the drums that you're getting ready to ship to the United States. They'll pull samples from those drums. And then after those samples are collected, those drums will all be loaded onto the shipping container. The container will be closed, and that auditor will apply a tamper evident seal with a specific serialized number on that seal. And that seal has been issued to NSF by TrueSource. And the auditor is the only one that's allowed to apply that seal. And then they record that they applied, seal number 1234 to this container load coming from India that was shipped by this particular exporter. So at that point, the honey's been sampled, the auditors watched it get loaded and put a seal on. When that container arrives in the U.S., that seal has to still be intact on that container, so there's been no tampering of those drums after they were loaded onto the container. It's an incredibly rigorous program. When you think about every container load that's shipped from a high-risk country to the United States has had that level of oversight by an independent auditor that's come and inspected those drums, collected samples, and applied the seal themselves to that shipping container. That's the high risk procedure in a high risk country for a TrueSource certified exporter.
Wow, that does increase the value of that TrueSource logo. I think the value of seeing that on a label.
So this exporter, then is the organization that's picking up the cost for all of this.
Yes, exactly.
And it's an every other year thing that every shipment, I imagine, is there a cost for every shipment? Let me put it that way.
So and just to clarify, so the financial audit is every other year. The TrueSource certified audit is every year. After that first year, the subsequent years are unannounced. So you never know when the auditor is going to show up to do that big comprehensive audit. They're just going to show up one day. Then every shipment that you have to go out, you call the audit firm to come and conduct that supervisory process. And so yes, there's a cost to that entire process. But one of the things is that cost is amortized over all the business that exporter does. And so a lot of these companies, ship hundreds of containers out. And that's probably a low estimate, hundreds of containers out every production season. And so they kind of wash that cost over all those pounds. And I think, all told, when you ascribe a cent per pound, it's relatively low as a total.
But you're dealing with audit companies in a lot of countries then.
Well, and that's where TrueSource doesn't really have any involvement there, because it's NSF, which that's their job. That's what that company does. They conduct audits worldwide, and the TrueSource audit is just one of their portfolio of audits they conduct. And so one of the things that can be attractive is a lot of these companies may undergo like a food safety audit. So NSF can show up to your factory and they can do your food safety audit, and then they can do your TrueSource audit at the same time.
Well, that makes sense, certainly. And from NSF's perspective, it makes them, I would guess, fairly competitive in the world of auditing.
Yeah, I mean, you'd hope so. And I don't know the dynamics of their world. I'm sure there's a lot of competition there as well. There's a lot of companies that do similar work. So, but it's a unique audit, and it's something that they've been more than happy to take on. They do a number of I'll call them niche audits that are sort of specialty and meet certain needs out in the marketplace.
So when that honey gets taken out of the container, once it reaches the U.S., what's the track then?
So good. So we've kind of discussed what happens in an export country, and that's the certified exporter. So now we need to move to the U.S., or actually to North America, because this covers both the U.S. and Canada. So we move to the U.S. and we talk about certified packers. And so For a certified packer, so their honey shows up at the port in the United States, and it shows up in this container. And in a lot of, and it depends on how your company operates. Some companies this container will arrive at their packing plant, sort of straight from the dock, and all the seals will be intact, and so they can verify that the seal that was attached in the foreign country, whether that was India, Argentina, or wherever, that seal is still on the container, and they're going to clip it off and unload the honey. The other way that works is that container goes to what's called a forwarding warehouse, and it's opened and the contents are stripped out. But as part of the process, that seal number is documented. So the workers that are emptying that container note that it showed up on this date at this time, and we clipped seal number 1234, and that's the true source seal number, and they record that in the documentation, and then the packer will send a dry van to pick up those drums, and that paperwork will follow along with that shipment. So when it arrives at the packer's facility, they'll have that document trail of seal 1234 was broken at the port, and they loaded the honey onto this dry van and shipped it to me. When the packer undergoes an audit, that's actually a big part of that audit process, is making sure that trail that will lead all the way back to the exporter in the foreign country and ultimately the beekeeper in the foreign country has been maintained. So we can see the seal numbers and the documentation is there to support every potential transition as that ocean container has gone from an export facility, travel overland, ocean container across the ocean, through customs in the U.S., and then ultimately to that packer's loading dock.
If you have a container that's got that tag on it, and it gets to customs, and customs says, "I want to see what's in there," does that happen? A, and B, if they clip that seal to get in there and examine that load, or does it happen? And if it does, how do you deal with that?
Well, so ideally what we would hope is that anytime a seal is broken, that gets recorded. And so that's sort of standard practice in the food industry. The requirement to have seals of some kind or another on all your transport devices, every dry van that gets loaded actually gets, even if it's not a true source seal, it gets a seal on it as one party in the supply chain transfers those goods to the next party. They put a seal on it to basically confirm, we loaded 66 drums on here, and when we shut the doors and put the seal on it, that's how many were in there, and here's the seal number we put on it. As standard practice, that's what we would expect to happen. Now, could it happen that someone forgets to write a seal down? That is a possibility, and that could potentially be flagged during an audit. That, hey, wait a minute, we have some paperwork here that's missing a seal in the process, so we need to flag that, and we need to figure out what's going on. And we need to see if that happened once out of 200 times, it's probably not a concern. If that's happening 100 out of 200 times, then you may fail your audit here because that doesn't make sense to us. But yes, customs can and does inspect some of these containers as they come in, and they will break those seals. And we would hope that they document that. You would hope that customs would document when they break a seal like that. And I've not personally seen when that hasn't happened, but in theory, anyone could forget to write down that seal number.
Just so we have let me wander a little bit here, just so we have a feel for the volume of honey that you're talking about. Well, the bigger picture is how much honey is consumed in the U.S., how much of that is imported, how much of that is produced here, and of the stuff that comes in from offshore, how much does True Source deal with? And maybe I'm catching you off guard with those numbers.
Well, I'll answer that as well as I can.
That's good.
So I think the U.S., if we look at 2018, I think the consumption number was awfully close to, can't remember whether it was 550 million pounds or 600 million pounds, but I'll use 550 million just to be conservative. And then of that 550 million pounds, approximately 150 million pounds was produced in the U.S. The balance there, which would be around 400 million pounds, was all imported. Then if we look at the current TrueSource certified members, and we're actually trying to collect the specific information that you just asked for, is what is the total volume of TrueSource certified members today? We don't have that exact number, but we estimate that number is probably somewhere around 30% of the total. And so if you look at 400 million pounds, 30% of that is going to be about 130 million pounds, give or take. And that number may also be a little bit conservative. The TrueSource volumes tend to be skewed a little bit towards sort of retail and club stores as opposed to ingredient use. So that just happens to be how the TrueSource certified member sort of mix kind of just wound up to skew more towards retail. And it may be because, retail has a greater interest in demonstrating to their consumers, their customers, that, they're selling TrueSource certified honey, that they're aware of this potential situation and they're doing something about it. And so that may be why it's a little more represented in retail than it might be in ingredient.
Well, to be able to put that good housekeeping seal on a bottle is certainly has to have some value. Once the consumer appreciates what's behind that seal, how well known are you?
Well, I would say that we're probably not a household name. We do get inquiries to our website where a consumer will have noticed the seal and will ask us some questions and want some more detail about how TrueSource certified works. And I think in almost every case, those folks, when they learn a little bit more about it, are pleased and impressed with how TrueSource certified works and kind of the rigor, the standards to which our members are holding themselves to in the industry. And so we do get a lot of positive feedback in that regard. And of course, we're always hoping that our recognition will grow and that more people will be aware of what TrueSource certified means and what we're trying to do, the work we're trying to do as an organization.
Well, I've seen some new retail products. I've just noticed them. There's a ketchup out there, and there's, I want to say, a cough medicine or some over the counter product. It says made with TrueSource honey. So that's got to be helping.
Yeah, this is something we're actually pretty excited about. That's a new program. It's only been around for, I think, even less than a year now. And we've got to give some credit to NSF because I mentioned, they do audits all the time at all kinds of different companies. And they said, hey, why don't we do a made with TrueSource certified honey program? And we can pitch that to our other clients. We can pitch that to our other clients who might manufacture and use honey. Wouldn't that be a good idea? And we said, well, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's talk about what the rules are going to be for that, and let you guys kind of pitch that to these other manufacturers. And so, yeah, we've got some great products that are out there right now using that made with TrueSource honey, and it's great to see that program grow. And we understand there's several more products in the pipeline that we hope to see here in the coming months as more manufacturers get on board, and that's a really important segment of the marketplace for us to sort of introduce to this idea of TrueSource honey and making sure you're using ethically sourced honey, because the ingredient industry is a little bit, they're not as exposed to scrutiny as retail is. If you see a bottle of honey on the shelf, Kim, and it's really, really cheap honey, and you think, well, how can they sell their honey that cheap? I think I'm gonna collect a sample of that and I'm gonna go get it tested. Well, you can't do that with ingredient honey. And so it's less subject to that kind of scrutiny. And so it's a little bit, when you're going to think about who might be today participating in questionable activity with honey, it's probably going to be much more prevalent in the ingredient side of the industry than it is in the retail side of the industry, because you're front and center on retail. It's exposed to the world. Anyone can check it out and see what you're doing.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, it's good. It's good to see that kind of exposure coming up. The numbers that you gave if I did my math quick here, it's about 80% of the honey consumed in the U.S. is imported, 20% is produced here in this country, and about a third of the honey that's produced here comes under true source people. Do I have those numbers right?
Yeah, I think a third of the total volume might be packaged by true source certified packers. And I think that number could be a little conservative, but don't want to overstate it.
Well, if I'm a packer, then I gotta believe that it's to my advantage to be able to make this claim, A, not only because it's going to help me in the retail market, but B, also because I'm able now to trust anybody that I'm dealing with.
Right, I would agree with that statement, Kim, and I want to be careful here because there are some companies who have chosen, not to pursue this route for their own. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that company. I don't want to suggest that if you're not true source certified, that makes you suspect. There may be companies who say, we have our own unique branding style and our marketing approach, and we're gonna do it our way. That's okay. So I want to be very careful not to say that that choosing not to be part of TrueSource automatically means you're questionable in any way.
Well, there's also a cost for that too. Those audits aren't free.
Sure, that's true, and so it's it depends on what your customer base is. Like I think if you're a small packer somewhere that serves has a sort of a niche product, or you may have your own sort of customer base that's very well connected with you. This may not, when you do the math, it may not be something that you think is of value, but if you're dealing with large retail grocers that distribute honey across the United States, that may be a great case for. And many of those retailers require true source. I want to back that up just a second. Some of those retailers require true source. Some of them encourage true source, and then some of them have really taken no position. So as a packer, you do limit your access to some markets if you're not true source certified. But that's only if you want to get into those big national distributors that sell retail all over the United States. Some of those big box stores, those big retail chains.
If I'm a U.S. packer and I want to have this audit done, do the audit people come in and go to my beekeepers, the beekeepers I buy from?
That's a good question, Kim. Yes, they do. So that's part of the certified packer audit in the United States. Now, because we've identified that beekeepers are really not the greatest point of risk, the way the U.S. packer audit works is the auditor will come in and they'll do that same inspection of your records to see where have you bought your honey from, and they'll look at your U.S. beekeepers. So how many U.S. beekeepers have you bought your honey from, and how much have you bought from each one of those beekeepers? And then that auditor is going to do two things. One is they'll get on the phone and they're going to call a selection of those beekeepers at random, and they're going to call them. They're going to say, hey, I'm here auditing this honey factory, this bottling plant, and these guys say they bought 3 truckloads of honey from you. Did you sell these guys 3 truckloads of honey this last year? And so verify that the amount claimed is what's actually being transacted there. And then as part of that, they will go out into the field and do a beekeeper audit, just like we discussed in the export countries. They'll select a beekeeper, they'll go out to the field, and they'll do that same examination, say how many colonies do you have? And they'll look at, just to make sure that they have the production capacity to support the amount of honey that they say they sold to that packer. With U.S. beekeepers, I think our commercial beekeepers are the largest in the world. So you're clearly not going to go inspect 6,000 colonies, but you're going to randomly go to a few bee yards to make sure that the beekeeper has bee yards where he says he does. And so that's kind of another element of how that works. But yes, a beekeeper inspection is one of the components of the packer audit in the United States.
Well, that's good to know. Now, I'm walking into a grocery store and I pick up a jar of honey, and it doesn't say True Source on it, but it says product of, and it names off 3 or 4 countries. Mm-hmm. And these are the people that are importing but are not part of True Source yet. Mm-hmm. Is there an issue with I guess with just listing the countries that it comes from.
And maybe I don't understand your question, Kim, but so any company that bottles honey is required to and should be clearly stating where that honey came from, the origin. And in the past, we've noticed that not all companies do that. Not all companies, clearly and honestly make that statement. But that's what should be happening. If you pick up that bottle, it should state exactly where it comes from. Just like if you go to the store to buy a shirt or a pair of jeans, you can look on that tag and it's supposed to tell you where those were manufactured. What country did these clothes come from? And it should be the same with a bottle of honey. It should be very obvious to you as the buyer, as the consumer, where did this honey come from? And that's going to be part of my purchase decision if I want to buy it or not.
Well, what have we missed here, Eric?
I think we've covered things from end to end and kind of looked at some of the details of True Source Certified. I guess I would note that if you want to read all the details, if you want to read the manual that describes all the rules, you can go to a website. It's TSH, so True Source Honey, so TSHmember.com. And that you'll get a listing of our members, whether those are packers or exporters, and it'll also have the rules. We talked about high risk and low risk countries. That chart is on there, and so if people want more information, they can get all the detail they'd ever want on that website. So it's all available for folks to take a look at. And we also have a website that's TrueSourceHoney.com. TrueSourceHoney.com is kind of the consumer-facing piece, but it's also got some great information. We actually list out all of the government actions that have taken place related to circumvention. We've got a newsroom with all the Customs and Border Protection, all their seizures and activities, and we've got some other general information about honey and True Source and circumvention. So that's the educational website that we started with before we had the certification program. And so either one of those sites are good places for information, but the real details are on that tshmember.com site.
I will have the proper links in the show notes. Well, thanks, Eric. This has been very educational, very, very good, and really needed, as Kim and I were talking earlier before you joined the call.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, and more than anything, I hope folks understand that what True Source Honey wants, I think, is the same thing that just about everybody else wants. Is we want honesty and transparency when it comes to what the product I'm buying. Just tell me where it's from. Make sure it's pure honey. Let me make my own decision about what product I want to choose when I go to the store. And don't be a cheater. Don't try to cheat me. And I think that's really what True Source Honey is working towards. And I think we all would agree that we all support those ideals. So I think that's where we want to see our industry continue to work towards. And there's lots of folks in our honey industry that are doing all kinds of things, not just True Source, but a lot of folks pursuing activities to make our industry a better place.
Well, this has been great. This has been great, Eric. I want to thank you for coming around today. And I again, appreciate the opportunity I had to meet you the first time on radio. So it panned out well. So thanks again for coming. I hope we can get you back here and talk maybe a little bit more about your the actions you have with retailers that are making products with True Source Honey, and give them some exposure too.
That sounds good. As that program grows, we may have a podcast worth of discussion there. Thanks, Kim.
There you go. Good.
All right. Well, thanks again, Eric, and look forward to talking to you again here in the future, and best of luck in the coming season. Thanks.
Right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, Kim. Well, it was fun to talk with Eric this afternoon. And I know you're about ready to travel again, and different sound, different locations. So good luck with your travels.
Yeah, I switched computers in between Eric and right now, and so it sounds a little bit different, but it was just a little bit ago that we were talking to him. And, I got to tell you, with 80% of the honey consumed in this country coming in from offshore, having some organization like True Source Honey looking out for us is really a good thing. I feel a lot more confident about what I'm seeing and who I'm competing against as a honey producer. Only 20% of the honey consumed in this country is produced here, and most of that goes retail, which is good because that's where the good stuff goes. But I'll tell you, the bigger picture here, Jeff, is not so much honey production, although that's what we were talking about today, but what are beekeepers doing? And they're producing less and less honey every year because there's more money in bees and less money in honey.
Yeah.
But as long as you're competing against China, India, Vietnam, all of these foreign countries that are sending really inexpensive honey here, at least I know it's the playing ground is relatively level. Is that a good term? I think if I'm gonna be selling honey at about $2.50 a pound and I'm competing against 97-cent Vietnam honey, at least I want to know it's from Vietnam and that it's not adulterated and that it's not bad. So it's about as good as it can get. But I tell you, for commercial beekeepers in this country, it's not a level playing field. I can't produce 97 cent a pound honey in North Dakota. Can't be done. So at least we know that the stuff that's coming in isn't going to hurt people. And I think that's probably the message today. These guys, True Source Honey, is taking seriously the threat that was there in terms of adulteration and in terms of government subsidized products. So it's about as good as it can get, and I think these guys are doing as well as could be expected under the conditions that they're working under. It was a good show, and Eric did a good job of explaining the program, and I hope they're able to expand their program on with retailers who use True Source Honey in their products and are going to promote it, so that at least people have a feel for, yeah, this is safe, this is good, I can trust this brand. And that's what it comes down to when you're selling to people.
I agree. I'd like to see the program expand and make it safer for everybody involved, the packers and the consumers.
Yeah, getting packers involved would be good. I mean, I can see his comment was it's expensive. There's a cost on those audits. And if I'm selling to, 2 grocery stores and a health food store, I don't really need this probably. And the other thing I was thinking about while he was talking is there another level of auditing that these people could do that would not cost as much yet capture that level of trust for? I could say I am True Source, and I mean I'm U.S. I got 400 colonies. How much auditing do you have to do? Can we knock the cost down so that I could get into this program and take advantage of that promotional? And I'd like to see that happen too, and it may come to be.
Yep. That about wraps it up for this podcast. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcast or wherever you download or stream your podcast. Also, feel free to send us comments or questions to questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you to this episode's sponsor, Glory Bee, the honey and beekeeping supply company committed to saving the bee, for sponsoring today's podcast with Eric Wenger of True Source Honey. You can find out more about Glory Bee at glorybee.com. And while you're there, make sure you give them a shout out for bringing us this great program. And finally, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listeners. You're the reason we do this, right, Kim?
Yeah, we couldn't do this without listeners. And today, Glory Bee was definitely beneficial for us. And, they're in a second generation out there. There's good folks at Glory Bee. I've known them for 30 years, and they do a good job, and they sell a good product. And thank you for reaching out and helping us today.
All right. Well, that does it. Thanks, Kim. Before you go, you're going somewhere, right? You're going south, aren't you? Someplace warm?
I'm going to Georgia tomorrow, and then I'm on the road a bunch this month. March is always a tough month. Going to Georgia and going to North Carolina, and then a couple meetings here in Ohio. On the road a lot in spring, and this is why my bees never do well, is because I'm not here when they need a lot of attention. So, you know what I've done? I'll tell you what I've done. I've switched to Russian bees because they wake up late in the spring. And when I get off the road, then my Russian bees are waking up. I like them because of how they produce, but I like them even better because they don't wake up until the middle of May.
Well, sounds like that's exactly what you need.
Travel safe, Jeff.
All right, you too. Take care. Bye-bye.